Legend speaks of men who plundered the coasts of Scandinavia, raping, robbing, murdering, and in general wreaking havoc across the land. Who were these men who thought they owned the land enough to do with whatever they pleased? These men were none other than the vicious Vikings. Today I would like to introduce you to the life of a Viking, from the meaning of being a Viking to the intellectual life of a Viking, and finally some of the political system of a Viking. Who we are as a people often helps to define what we do. So the definition of a Viking is anyone who puts their boat in an inlet, creek, or bay, whether for raiding or not. The word Viking also comes from the Old Norse verb viksha, which means to leave behind, to go away, or simply to leave home. Virtues and the things we do to the people we care about also help define who we are as a people. Vikings were considered men of honor. They would help their families and the friends. They were loyal to each other, and they were kind and generous, at least when they were at home. As Ulrich Hauge once said about Vikings, a man of honor was a principled man. He was given to moderation, was hospitable and generous, and offered a helping hand to friends in need, including aligning himself against his friends' enemies. A man of honor also never forgot to be the foe of his enemy. This he did with all of his heart. How do we get this information on what a Viking is if they're cruel, barbaric, and primitive? Well, the intellectual life of a Viking wasn't actually that simple. They had literature, which consisted of poetry and other stories, which they considered a gift from their gods. Although not all Vikings wrote, some of them did. Those that did write used an alphabet, which consisted of 24 Forthwork or Forthrak, which then was simplified to only 16 runes. Many things were written by the Vikings, but these were considered gifts from the gods, or at least their highest pagan god, and this was therefore limited on what they were allowed to write. An example of one of these poems is found in Christine Wolf's book, and was in honor of a woman's child. Like men, they went far to seek gold, and in the east they fed the eagle, died in the south, encircled the Arab caliphates. The language of the Vikings was Old Norse. According to a site called Herswick, during the Viking Age, language was no barrier to communication across the Norse lands. From Greenland to the Baltic, nearly the same language was spoken throughout. There were East and West dialects, just as there are in the United States, but everybody could understand each other. That being said, the dialects of the Vikings were different enough to be able to distinguish where somebody was from. Just like somebody with a New Jersey accent talking to somebody with a Southern accent would make it so you knew where each of them were from, just based on the way they were talking. Although literature and language were a huge part of their culture, the political system was also a huge part. The political system was similar to ours, as there were 3 classes that were based on wealth, but other than that, they were fairly different. The lowest class was the slaves. The slaves had no rights whatsoever. They were property to their owners. They were so low that they were often sacrificed with their owners when the owners died to continue to serve the owners even in death. There were a few occasions where slaves were released from servitude or they bought their freedom, but in these cases, they were still the lowest of the low. The middle class, which were more often considered the freemen, were considered the backbone of the society. They were the craftsmen, priests, lawyers, and farmers, and in general, they did most of the work that the slaves did not. Freemen were also distinguished by their social status. The wealthier you were, the higher up on the social ladder you were. The poor freeman, though, was considered to be the responsibility of his or her relatives. The final and wealthiest group were the nobles. The nobles were the ruling party and were the ones that lived in luxury. They were so high up on the social ladder that they had kingdoms and earldoms, and there were so many of them that king was just tossed around like it meant nothing, fairly freely at least. The king had to be of royal descent, as in to keep the god's blood here on earth, but otherwise it was pretty tossed around easily. At first, this seemed to cause a lot of struggles, but eventually they combined into 3 kingdoms and were very powerful. This led to the 3 Scandinavian countries we have now. To conclude, I've explained who the Vikings are by definition, their intellectual life, and the political system of the Vikings. These are important things to know as to help us better understand who they are as a people. I hope I have helped you to better understand the life of a Viking and wanting to learn more of other people.